Before we begin, if you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them felt like losing the version of yourself worth keeping, this story was written for you. Drop a like and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because nothing about this man is what it appears to be. The black sedan arrived every spring without fail. It came on a Tuesday, always a Tuesday, when the harbor fog still clung to the cobblestones of Seabrook Cove like something that refused to let go. The car was a 1967 Cadillac DeVille, restored to a perfection that felt almost aggressive, glossy black paint that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, chrome trim polished to a surgical shine, tinted windows that gave nothing away. It moved through the narrow streets of the coastal town the way a shark moves through shallow water, silent, deliberate, quietly wrong in a way that made the body register danger before the mind caught up. Nobody in Seabrook Cove knew the driver's name. They knew the routine. The car would park in the same spot on Whitmore Lane, halfway between the old cannery and the harbor wall. The driver would step out alone, wearing clothes too expensive for the town and too understated for a man of obvious means. Dark trousers, a charcoal coat, no tie, no rings. He was somewhere in his early 30s, broad-shouldered but not conspicuously built, with a face that had been handsome once and now carried something heavier than age. His gray eyes did the thing eyes do when a person has trained themselves not to feel things in public. They looked at everything and registered nothing. He would walk the 4 blocks to Rowan's flower shop on Harbor Street. He would stand at the counter for no more than 3 minutes. He would ask for a single bouquet of white tulips. He paid in cash. Always exact change, always rubber-banded with a neatness that suggested either obsessive habit or military discipline. He never made small talk. He never browsed. He accepted the wrapped bouquet, tucked it under one arm, and walked back to the car. Within 10 minutes of arrival, the black sedan was gone, swallowed back into whatever world had produced it. For 3 years running, this had been the whole of it. Ivy Rowan had stopped trying to make conversation after the second visit. She'd tried the first time, asked if he wanted a card, offered to add seasonal greens, smiled the way she smiled at customers she was genuinely curious about. He'd looked at her like she'd asked him to disarm a bomb, paid, and left without a word. The second year, she'd simply prepared the tulips in advance after he appeared on the security camera feed she'd installed for the parking lot, handed them over. He'd looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, said something that might have been thank you or might have been nothing at all, and walked out. By the third spring, she had the tulips ready before he reached the door. He'd noticed. She saw it in the slight shift of his jaw, something that stopped just short of surprise. He picked up the bouquet without speaking, set the cash on the counter, and left. But at the door, he paused with his back still to her. She waited. He didn't turn around. After a moment, he pushed through and was gone. Ivy had stood there for a long time afterward, holding the counter with both hands, feeling something she couldn't name crawl up through her chest. She was 26 years old. She ran the shop her grandmother had built from a converted boathouse in 1971. She knew every regular customer by name, knew which anniversary lilies went to which husband, knew which teenagers bought chrysanthemums for the funerals they were too young to know how to process. She was good at reading people. It was a survival skill, not a gift. She'd learned it the hard way, the way most useful things are learned. She did not know what to make of the man with the white tulips. She only knew that he came back. Every spring, he came back. And for a woman who'd spent the better part of a decade learning how to live with the fact that the people who mattered most had a way of disappearing, that single consistency meant more than she was comfortable admitting. The 4th Tuesday of April arrived. Ivy was in the back room when she heard the bell above the front door. She was repotting a tray of ranunculus, hands dark with soil, and she felt something shift in her stomach before she even looked up. Not instinct exactly, more like recognition, the body remembering something the mind hadn't consciously filed. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front. He was standing at the counter, the charcoal coat, the same posture, contained, controlled, the stillness of a man who'd taught himself never to look like he was waiting. The white tulip bouquet was already sitting on the counter between them because she'd arranged it that morning without thinking about it, the way you set a place at a table for someone you've already decided is coming home. He looked at the bouquet, then at her. You remembered, he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't fluctuate much regardless of what was happening behind it. She'd heard voices like that before. Her father had a voice like that. It was the voice of someone who'd spent a long time making sure that nothing he felt became visible to anyone who might use it against him. It's the same order every year, Ivy said. Wouldn't exactly call it a feat of memory. Something passed across his face. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she found herself cataloging it, filing it somewhere she'd revisit later when she was alone, and had no good reason to be thinking about strange customers. He picked up the bouquet, set the cash on the counter, folded square, exact amount. You added baby's breath this year, he said. Ivy blinked. She had. She'd done it without really deciding to. A handful of white clusters tucked between the tulip stems because the arrangement had looked somehow incomplete, somehow like something was missing from it. She hadn't been able to articulate why until right now, standing in front of this man who'd noticed in about 3 seconds. Does that bother you? She asked. He considered the question for what felt longer than it warranted. No, he said. It's better. He left. Ivy stood at the window and watched the Cadillac pull away from Whitmore Lane. Then she turned around and found her 9-year-old son standing in the doorway to the back room in his after-school clothes, homework folder tucked under one arm, watching the empty space the car had occupied with those serious gray eyes of his. Who was that? Owen asked. Customer, Ivy said. Owen looked at her. He had a way of looking at people that suggested he was running calculations behind his eyes, sorting information into categories she didn't have access to. It had always slightly unnerved her, that look. It was too composed for a 9-year-old, too careful. He drives a really old car, Owen said. Classic, Ivy corrected automatically. That's called a classic car. Why does he come here every year? I don't know. Did you ask? No. Owen seemed to consider this. Why not? Ivy picked up her soil-stained apron from the counter and folded it over her arm. Because some people, she said carefully, have stories they're not ready to tell yet. Her son absorbed that with the equanimity of a child who'd grown up in a household where certain truths were carried quietly and not unpacked in public. He nodded once and disappeared back into the workroom to do his homework at the potting table, the way he did every Tuesday and Thursday when she worked late. Ivy stood in the quiet shop for a moment. Then she walked to the window again. The lane was empty. The fog was beginning to thin as the afternoon leaned into evening, and the harbor light cut gold across the wet cobblestones. She should have been finishing the ranunculus. She had a funeral order due Thursday, and a wedding order due Saturday, and a stack of invoices she'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. Instead, she stood at the window thinking about the way the man had said, "It's better." Quiet and certain, like someone who'd spent a long time knowing exactly what was missing from things. She didn't know his name, she didn't know where he came from or where he went when he left Seabrook Cove or why. Out of everywhere in the world, he chose this particular shop on this particular street to buy white tulips on a Tuesday in April. What she knew was the feeling that had settled into her chest like sediment after 3 years of watching him go, the specific, inconvenient weight of someone who reminds you of a door you thought you'd closed. Damien Vale had been many things in his 32 years on Earth. He had been a boy who slept on a cot in the back of a hardware store in Providence because his mother couldn't keep the heat on in December. He had been a teenager who learned very quickly that intelligence without protection was just another way to be a target, and who'd made the necessary adjustments with the coldly logical efficiency that would later make him both very dangerous and very rich. He had been a soldier in a structure he'd never asked to be born adjacent to, then a lieutenant in one he'd chosen, then a captain, then something with no official title but with a great deal of official authority. He had been, for the last 6 years, the most quietly feared figure on the eastern seaboard, the kind of man whose name was spoken in certain circles with a very specific category of respect, the kind that was indistinguishable from fear. He had also been, once, a 17-year-old boy standing in a garden behind a house in Seabrook Cove, holding a girl's hand and making promises he'd believed with every available part of himself. That was the thing about being Damien Vale. The architecture of everything he'd become had been built specifically to entomb that boy. Layer by layer, decision by decision, each choice compounding the last until the distance between who he was at 17 and who he was now was so vast that crossing it felt not just unlikely, but structurally impossible. And yet every April he drove to Seabrook Cove. Every April he bought white tulips, because that was what she'd loved. White tulips from the old harbor market where they'd spent Saturday mornings when they were 16, when the world was small enough to navigate by foot and feel. He told himself it was containment, a controlled release of pressure. Let himself have the town for 20 minutes, the routine, the proximity, and then get back in the car and drive back to the life that had made proximity impossible. He was not sentimental. Sentimentality was a luxury that got people killed. He was disciplined. The thing was, discipline, but real discipline, the kind forged under actual duress, was supposed to hold. It was supposed to be stronger than circumstance, and for years it had been. He'd kept the ritual small and contained. 20 minutes. White tulips. Leave. This year he'd spent nearly 4 minutes in the shop. He noticed the anomaly on the drive back to Providence, somewhere on the interstate with the bouquet sitting on the passenger seat and the windows cracked to cut the smell. 4 minutes. He'd spoken to her. Not much. Barely anything. But he'd spoken. Last year, he hadn't spoken at all. The year before, he'd said, "Keep the change," which barely counted. He told her the arrangement was better. Damien kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road and worked methodically through the inventory of what had gone wrong. He'd noticed the baby's breath because it hadn't been there before, and his attention to detail was not something he could selectively disable just because the context was personal rather than professional. He'd commented because commenting was the most natural response to noticing. He'd done it without thinking, which was itself the problem. That there existed a space, evidently, a context in which Damien Vale did things without thinking. He didn't like it. He also couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at him when he said it. Not surprised exactly. More like someone who'd just received a confirmation they'd been half expecting. Careful, watchful, a little guarded. She'd grown into that quality. The girl he'd known at 17 had been open in a way that made him feel simultaneously safer and more terrified than anything else in his life. This woman had learned to hold things back. She'd learned the particular art of waiting to see what someone would do before deciding how much to give them. That made two of them. He made it back to Providence in 3 hours. Let himself into the townhouse on Benefit Street through the back entrance, the way he always did, because front doors were for people who weren't carrying the kind of professional history that made threat assessment a perpetual background process. His head of security, a compact, relentlessly composed man named Rourke, who'd been with him for 5 years and still wasn't entirely sure he'd survived the relationship, was waiting in the kitchen. "Clean drive," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. "Clean drive," Damien confirmed. Rourke's eyes went to the tulips and then quickly away. He'd learned not to ask about April. "The Marchetti meeting's been moved to Thursday, and Silas called." Damien paused with his coat still on. "What did he want?" "Didn't say. Asked if you were in town. I told him you were unavailable." "Good." Damien set the bouquet on the counter. He'd buy a vase for it and put it in the study where no one went except him, and by the time it wilted, he'd have the April aberration back under control. "When does Silas expect a call back?" He said whenever, but his tone was... Rourke paused, choosing his word with the caution of someone who understood that imprecision was a liability. Pointed. Damien thought about Silas Granger. They'd come up through the same structure together, though from different angles. Silas was old organization, built on inherited connections and a particular brand of loyalty that was really just carefully managed self-interest. He'd been useful. He was smart enough to be dangerous, which made him precisely the kind of problem that didn't announce itself until it was already inside the walls. "I'll call him tomorrow," Damien said. He carried the tulips to the study. He stood in the dark for a moment before turning on the light, holding the bouquet by its wrapped stem, and it was in that particular quiet that the discipline slipped just far enough for the rest of it to get through, the way the shop had smelled, the same combination of damp soil and sweet grass and something floral that he'd spent 10 years not letting himself think about. The sound of a child's voice from the back room. He'd heard it. He'd registered it and filed it and not looked toward it, because looking toward things you couldn't afford to have was the first step toward a specific category of destruction. But he'd heard it. Owen Rowan was not a difficult child. He was, by most available assessments, an unusually manageable one, self-contained in ways that occasionally worried his mother, serious in ways that occasionally worried his teachers, and possessed of a gravity that manifested primarily as a habit of watching situations from the outside edge before deciding whether to engage. He was also, Ivy had always privately noted, about as much like her as a rain cloud is like a sunflower. She'd never spoken this observation aloud because it was the kind of thought that felt dangerous if you gave it too much air. She'd been 17 when Owen was conceived, alone in the most comprehensive sense of the word by the time she was 18, and by necessity she'd built a version of her life story in which his father was simply absent. Not malicious, not complicated, just gone, in the way that some people are gone, and you make your peace with it and move forward. She had made her peace with it, mostly. There were moments, and this had been one of them, watching Owen stare after the black Cadillac with those gray eyes gone quiet and calculating, where the peace developed hairline fractures. She didn't chase the thought. Thursday came and went. The funeral order shipped on time. 40 white roses, 12 stalks of larkspur, a spray of dark green eucalyptus for a woman named Helen Marsh, who'd been the town's librarian for 30 years and had apparently loved the color blue. Ivy arranged them herself. Took her time, because Helen had been the kind of person who deserved flowers that were thought about rather than assembled. Friday was the usual organized chaos. 2 school pickup orders, a corporate arrangement for the hotel on Pier Street, a last-minute request for a birthday display from someone who'd apparently remembered their spouse's birthday approximately 4 hours before it occurred. Owen helped after school, moving through the workroom with the quiet competence of a kid who'd grown up here, who knew which flowers bruised easy and which shears were the good ones, and not to put the stargazer lilies near the ranunculus because the smell was too aggressive when they were packed together. He was good at it, patient in a way that felt inherited from somewhere she couldn't identify. Saturday was the wedding. Ivy was up at 4. Owen slept through her 4 a.m. alarm with the deep unconsciousness of a child who had no anxiety about schedules, which she envied with a ferocity she usually managed to keep private. She loaded the van in the dark, driving to the reception venue on Bleecker Point with the windows down, because April mornings smelled like everything that was still possible, before the day got its hands on them. She set up the arrangements in 2 hours, drank bad catering coffee, collected her payment, and drove back through a town that was just beginning to wake up. She stopped at the harbor to watch the fishing boats go out. It was something she did sometimes, when she had the time and the mood for it, standing at the rail with her hands in her coat pockets, watching the boats shrink toward the horizon until they were just shapes, and then less than shapes, and then gone. She'd been doing it since she was a teenager. Back then, she'd done it with her hand in someone else's, both of them quiet, the way 2 people are quiet when they've said everything and don't need to fill the space. She didn't do that anymore. The quiet now was entirely her own. She was about to leave when she saw the black Cadillac. It was parked on the harbor road 50 yards from where she was standing. Engine off. Just sitting there in the early Saturday light with the harbor behind it, which was wrong because the man came on Tuesdays, and this was Saturday, and for a second she wondered if she was manufacturing things. If 3 years of noticing had built a specific neural pathway that was now generating images from thin air. But no, it was real. The car was real. The same plates, the same chrome trim. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked away, because some instincts are older and more reliable than curiosity, and the instinct she'd developed over 26 years of making do was telling her that some things were not hers to understand, and that reaching for them anyway was how you ended up holding something that could not be put back down. She walked back to the van. She didn't look at the car again, but her hand shook slightly as she unlocked the door, and she sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before starting the engine, breathing carefully, the way she did when something she hadn't prepared for had gotten too close. Damien hadn't planned to come back on Saturday. He'd driven back to Seabrook Cove because Rourke had pulled security flags from the area, something routine. A sweep he ran on all locations Damien visited with any regularity, cross-checking for surveillance activity or unusual vehicle presence. There'd been a flag on Thursday. 2 men in a rental car, a blue Volvo, parked near the harbor road for 3 hours before moving on. No known affiliations but a profile that read wrong. Ages, vehicle type, The particular quality of people trying to look like they weren't paying attention to anything. It might be nothing. It wasn't nothing. Damien had driven back himself because sending Rourke was a declaration, and he wasn't ready to make declarations. He'd done 2 passes through town before 7 a.m. and found nothing obviously actionable. The Volvo wasn't present. The harbor road was ordinary Saturday morning quiet. Fishing boats, a few early joggers, a woman at the rail with her hands in her pockets, and her dark hair loose in the wind off the water. He recognized her from 50 yards before he consciously processed the recognition. He'd pulled over. He'd sat with both hands on the wheel and watched her the way he'd been not watching her for 3 years. Peripherally, carefully, always with the awareness that watching was a vector of attachment, and attachment was the thing he'd already decided he couldn't afford. She was standing the way she used to stand at 17 at this exact rail in this exact harbor, like she was thinking about something she wouldn't put into words. Some things apparently didn't change. She turned and looked directly at the car. He didn't move. The windows were dark enough. She couldn't see him, he knew that. But the quality of her look was different from someone trying to identify a vehicle. It was the look of someone who already knew what they were looking at and was deciding what to do about it. He felt something shift in his chest that he spent approximately 3 seconds pretending wasn't there. Then she walked back to her van without looking at the car again. Damien sat in the Cadillac until she was gone. Then he pulled out his phone and called Rourke. "The flag from Thursday," he said. "Run it deeper. Cross-check with Granger's network. Whatever overlaps, I want it tonight." "You think it's connected?" Damien watched the harbor. The fishing boats were small now, almost gone. "I think it's April," he said. "And April is when things go wrong." He started the car. He was halfway back to the interstate when his phone buzzed. "Rourke, text message. Cross-check complete. Both flag subjects are former associates of Silas Granger. Last known employment, enforcement. The boy the neighbor mentioned seen at the flower shop. What does he look like?" Damien read the message twice. Then he set the phone face down on the passenger seat where the tulips had been 3 days ago and pressed his foot to the accelerator until the speedometer read things it had no business reading. There was a boy. He'd heard the voice from the back room. He hadn't let himself look. He hadn't let himself look because looking was the beginning of wanting, and wanting was the beginning of everything he'd structured his entire existence around not doing. But Rourke hadn't mentioned the boy in any previous report. Rourke didn't miss things, which meant this was new information, new enough that Rourke was asking about it now, in the context of a threat assessment, which meant the boy existed in a frame Damien was only now beginning to construct. The boy the neighbor mentioned. Ivy was 26. He'd left when she was 17. He pressed his foot harder against the floor and let the math do what math does. Clean, impartial, indifferent to how badly you needed it to come out differently than it did. The math didn't lie. Damien had known that going in. He'd done it twice on the drive back to Providence, both times arriving at the same number. 9 years old, give or take, depending on the month. He'd left Seabrook Cove in July. Which meant if the timing held, if the arithmetic was as clean as it appeared, then the child he'd heard laughing in the back room of a flower shop on Harbor Street had been alive for the entirety of the life Damien had built to replace the one he'd walked away from. He didn't sleep Saturday night. He sat in the study with the tulips on the desk in front of him and the city quiet outside the window and worked through every possible counterargument with the same methodical precision he brought to anything that threatened to become unmanageable. The boy could be anyone's. Ivy was 26, and she'd had 9 years to build something new, something with someone else. And that was exactly what she should have done. And the idea of it produced a specific sensation behind his sternum that he identified and categorized and set aside because it was not useful. The boy could be 9 or 8, could be a neighbor's kid, could be anything, could be his. At 2 a.m., he called Rourke. "The child," Damien said without preamble. "Age, description, whatever the neighbor told you." Rourke's voice was even. He'd been awake, which was itself not surprising. "Female neighbor, 60-something, lives 2 doors down from the shop. She mentioned the boy in passing when my contact asked about the area's regular foot traffic. Said the florist's kid is 9, maybe 10. Smart boy, quiet. Has his mother's face except for the eyes." Damien waited. She said the eyes were unusual, Rourke continued. Said they were, and I'm quoting, the kind of gray you don't see much, like old pewter. The study was very still. That's all she said? Damien asked. That's all she said. Damien ended the call. He looked at the tulips for a long time. The baby's breath had already begun to soften at the edges, the tiny white clusters losing their architecture. By Monday, they'd be finished. He picked up the phone again and called a different number, one he'd never used for anything remotely connected to his professional life. A contact in county records, a woman who owed him a favor he'd never collected because he'd never needed it badly enough until now. Birth records, he said when she answered. Seabrook Cove area. The name is Rowan. First name Owen. Born approximately 9 to 10 years ago. The woman on the other end was quiet for a moment. Father listed? That's what I need to know. She called back in 40 minutes. Damien didn't move from the desk in the interim. He sat with both hands flat on the surface and breathed in the controlled way he'd learned in a context that had nothing to do with flower shops or harbor towns. The technique Rourke had taught him early on, when staying functional under sustained pressure was a professional requirement rather than a personal one. The phone buzzed. Owen James Rowan, the woman said. Born October 14th. Mother, Ivy Catherine Rowan. Father, a pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Listed as unknown. Damien sat with that for 3 seconds. Thank you, he said. The favor's cleared. He set the phone down. He looked at his hands on the desk, the particular architecture of them, the scar along the left index finger from a chain-link fence in Providence when he was 14, the knuckles that had been broken and reset twice and healed slightly wrong. He'd spent years making these hands into instruments of a very specific kind of function. Unknown. She'd written unknown. He didn't know what he'd expected. He didn't know what he'd hoped for. He only knew that the words settled into him like something cold and heavy and irrefutable, and that for the first time in 6 years, Damien Vale had no operational protocol for what he was feeling. Monday morning, Ivy found the envelope. It was tucked under the front door of the shop. Not the mail slot, but slid under the actual door, which required intent. A plain white envelope with no name on it. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in a hand she didn't recognize. Don't open the shop. She stood in the doorway reading it for a long time. The morning was gray, the harbor fog not yet burned off, and the street was still mostly empty at 7:30. She looked both ways, a reflex the kind that arrives before thought, and saw nothing unusual. A delivery truck 2 blocks down, an older man walking a dog toward the pier. She almost called the police. She'd had a cousin who'd received notes like this once, years ago, connected to something Ivy had never fully understood and hadn't asked about because asking about certain things in certain families was its own kind of decision. The cousin had not called the police. Things had eventually resolved themselves in a way that Ivy knew better than to examine too closely. The memory made her chest tight. She folded the note, put it in her apron pocket, opened the shop. Not because she was brave, because she had a funeral order due Thursday and a mortgage payment due the 15th, and Owen's school fees were already 3 weeks late, and bravery was a concept for people who had the luxury of alternatives. The morning passed without incident. 2 walk-ins, 1 phone order, a teenager who came in for a single sunflower and paid in quarters, with the focused solemnity of someone spending their last dollar on something that mattered. Ivy watched each customer longer than she usually did. Watched the street through the window between arrangements. Nothing happened. By noon, she'd half convinced herself the note was wrong door. Someone's misdelivered drama. Nothing to do with her. By 2, she was almost back to normal. By 3, Owen was at the potting table doing arithmetic homework and asking her the difference between perennials and annuals with the focused inquiry of a kid who'd decided to understand everything in front of him. And she was explaining it and watching his face do the thing it did when he was filing information away. And the afternoon had the specific quality of a life that was small and functional and hers. At 3:45, she looked up and saw the black Cadillac parked on Whitmore Lane. Not moving. Just there. In the same spot it occupied every April Tuesday, except this was Monday, and last week had already been the annual visit, which meant this was something else entirely. Her hand stilled on the ranunculus she was trimming. Owen was bent over his homework. pencil moving. Ivy set down the shears very carefully and walked to the front window. The car's windows were dark. She couldn't see inside. She stood there for approximately 30 seconds, doing nothing, which was itself a decision, a choice to not react, to not walk out there, to not invite whatever was waiting in that car to come inside. Then the driver's door opened. He got out. He was wearing different clothes than he wore on Tuesdays. Darker, more casual, a heavy jacket over a black shirt. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, which surprised her because nothing about him had ever suggested any kind of vulnerability before. He stood beside the car looking at the shop, and even from across the street she could see that the controlled stillness he usually carried was operating under some kind of strain. It was still there. The composure was still there, but something beneath it was pushing upward. He crossed the street, the bell above the door. Owen looked up from his homework. His eyes went to the man, then back to his homework, then back to the man. A double take so precise and involuntary it was almost clinical. Ivy stepped forward. "We're not expecting a delivery." The man looked at her. "I know." "It's Monday." "I know." She waited. He had the look of someone who'd prepared what they were going to say and was now confronting the gap between preparation and actual execution. "I need to speak with you," he said, privately. She felt Owen watching them both from the corner of his eye, doing it the way he did everything. Sideways, quiet, cataloging. "My son is here," she said. "I see that." Something in his voice when he said it. Not much, barely a tremor, quickly managed, but she'd heard it. "Owen," she said without looking away from the man, "go in the back and finish your math." "I'm almost done." "Owen." A pause. The sound of a stool scraping back. Footsteps. The workroom door clicking shut. Ivy and the man stood in the quiet shop. "What's your name?" she asked. She'd never asked before. She asked now because the envelope was in her apron pocket, and the car had been on the street, and something was happening that she'd been on the edges of without knowing it. He held her gaze. "Damien." She waited for a last name. He didn't offer one. She noted the absence and filed it. "The note under my door this morning," she said. "Was that from you?" Something shifted in his face, sharpened. "What note?" She reached into her apron pocket and held it out. He took it, his fingers careful not to touch hers, she noticed, deliberate about the distance, and read it. His jaw tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible. "That wasn't from me," he said. "Then who? Was anything else unusual this morning?" His voice had changed, not louder, more focused, the way a lens focuses, pulling everything that was diffuse into a single sharp point. "Anyone outside when you arrived? Any vehicles you didn't recognize?" "You're frightening me." "Good," he said flatly. "You should be frightened, not of me, but you should be." He set the note on the counter between them. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you not to argue with the first part until I've finished the second part. Can you do that?" Ivy looked at him. At the note. At the door to the workroom behind which her son was pretending to do arithmetic. "Talk," she said. He didn't tell her everything. He told her enough, which, even calibrated down to the minimum viable disclosure, was still significantly more than Ivy Rowan had been prepared to hear on a Monday afternoon in April. He told her that he operated in a world with enemies, that those enemies had recently identified a point of leverage, that the note was likely a warning, not a threat exactly, but the first visible surface of something that had been moving beneath the surface for longer than the note implied. He did not tell her who he was. He did not tell her what he'd built or how. He did not tell her about the math he'd done on Saturday night, or the birth record, or the 4 words written in county records 9 years ago by a 17-year-old girl writing unknown in the space where a father's name was supposed to go. Ivy listened to everything he said with her arms crossed and her eyes on his face and the expression of someone translating a language they don't speak, while simultaneously making structural decisions about whether to trust the translator. "You're telling me someone left that note," she said when he was done. "Yes." "And they left it because of you." "That's my current assessment. Yes." "And you know this because Because I've been monitoring the area, he said, for your safety. The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that follows a statement that has revealed more than it intended to. My safety, Ivy repeated. He didn't qualify it. You've been monitoring this area for my safety, the same area where you come every April to buy white tulips. She uncrossed her arms and set both hands flat on the counter, and there was something in her posture now that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear. It was the thing underneath both, the structural load-bearing thing. Damien, I need you to tell me who you are. That's not simple. I didn't ask for simple. He looked at her for a long moment. Behind the workroom door, the faint scratch of a pencil on paper had stopped. Owen was listening. Damien knew it, and he suspected Ivy knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it because acknowledging it would require them to have a different conversation than the one they were already barely managing. I'm someone who made decisions a long time ago, he said, decisions that I believed were protecting the people I cared about, and those decisions have... He stopped, started again. There are consequences. I'm managing them. Managing them, she said. In my town. In your town. She held his gaze. You need to leave. Ivy, I don't know you. Her voice was level and very careful, the voice of someone who has learned that precision under pressure is the only thing that holds. You come in here once a year and you don't speak and you don't explain yourself, and I have never pushed because I don't push, that's not... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. I have a son. Whatever you're managing, whatever is happening because of you, it cannot be here. You need to leave and take it with you. Damien stood very still. The note was a message for me, he said quietly. Not a threat to you, but the distinction may not hold. Then make it hold. I'm trying. Try somewhere else. She picked up the note from the counter and held it out to him. Take this. Handle it. And don't come back here until whatever this is finished. He took the note. Their fingers touched this time. Briefest contact, her knuckles against his, both of them going still for a half-second that lasted significantly longer than a half-second. He left. Ivy stood at the window and watched him cross the street and get in the car and sit there for a moment without starting the engine. She was shaking, which she hadn't realized until she was alone and had no reason to keep her hands steady. The workroom door opened. Owen stood in the doorway. He wasn't holding his pencil anymore. He was just standing there looking at her with those gray eyes that she'd been carefully not thinking about for 9 years. Mom, he said. Yeah. Is everything okay? She turned from the window. She made herself smile, the specific smile she kept in reserve for moments when the truth was not something Owen needed to carry yet. Everything's fine, she said. How's the arithmetic? He looked at the window, then back at her. He's still there, Owen said. She turned. The Cadillac was still at the curb, engine off. I know, she said. Why? I don't know. Owen was quiet for a moment, then, his eyes are like mine. The shop went very still. The kind of still where the background noise of the harbor and the street and the ventilation system all continue but become somehow distant, like audio heard through glass. Owen, I'm not asking about it, he said. He said it with the equanimity of someone who'd been thinking about something for a long time before saying it. I'm just telling you what I noticed. He went back into the workroom and pulled the door shut. Ivy stood in the middle of the flower shop with the harbor light coming through the front window and the smell of ranunculus in the air and 9 years of carefully maintained architecture developing cracks in about 30 separate places at once. The Cadillac was gone when she locked up at 6. She drove home on autopilot, Owen in the passenger seat talking about a project he was doing on migratory birds, the specific concentration of a kid who'd filed away the difficult thing for later and was returning to manageable ground in the interim. She answered his questions. She made the right turns. She got them both home to the small blue house on Sycamore Drive and heated up leftover soup and watched him eat and thought about gray eyes and white tulips and the way Damien's voice had changed when he'd said, I see that while looking at her son. She almost called her cousin. Instead, she called the only other person she trusted with anything that couldn't be fixed by normal means. A woman named Petra Voss, who'd been her best friend since they were 12, and who now worked as a paralegal in Portland and had a specific talent for identifying when a situation had left the territory of manageable without the person inside it realizing it yet. "I need to tell you something," Ivy said. "Always a good opening," Petra said. "Go." Ivy told her about the note, about Damien, about the Cadillac on the street after hours. She left out the part about Owen's eyes because that was a thread she wasn't ready to pull in a phone conversation. Petra was quiet through most of it, which was how Petra processed things. In real time, organizing, not filling space with noise while she thought. "The note said don't open the shop," Petra said when Ivy finished. "Yes." "And the man, Damien, said it wasn't from him." "Yes." "And you believe him?" Ivy paused. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the soup gone cold, and Owen's backpack on the floor, and the specific quiet of a house where a child was asleep and the adult responsible for them was not. "Yes," she said. "I believe him." "Why?" "I don't know, I just—" She stopped. He was scared, Petra. Not in an obvious way. But I could see it. Whatever was in that note, it scared him. And nothing about that man reads like something that scares easily. Petra was quiet again. Then, "Ivy, the man comes to your shop once a year, pays cash, doesn't give his name, and shows up on a non-scheduled day to tell you that you might be in danger because of him. That's a very specific set of behaviors." "I know. That's organized crime behavior, Ivy." The word landed in the kitchen with the specific weight of a thing named out loud that had been avoided being named until now. "I know," Ivy said again, quieter. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." "You have Owen." "I know." Her voice cracked slightly on the second word, and she pressed her hand flat against the table and breathed through it. "I know I have Owen. That's why I don't know." They stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes without arriving at anything actionable, which was sometimes the only available outcome. Petra offered to drive down. Ivy told her not to yet. They hung up with the understanding that yet was doing a lot of structural work in that sentence. Ivy sat at the table for a long time after. Then she went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Owen's room. He slept on his side, dark hair against the pillow, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress in the boneless way of children who haven't yet learned to protect themselves during sleep. His breathing was even. His face was completely at rest. She looked at him for a long time. Then she went back downstairs and opened her laptop and typed a name into the search bar. Damien Vale. She'd guessed at the last name. It was a reach, she knew that. But the first name was uncommon enough, and something in the way he carried himself had been specific enough that she'd had a direction even before she'd admitted it to herself. The results came back in 4 seconds. She stared at the screen. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she'd been given once, years ago, by her cousin, with the instruction that it was only for if something went badly wrong and she had no other options. She'd memorized it and never used it and hoped she'd never need to. It rang twice. A man answered. "Yeah." "I need information about someone," Ivy said. A name came up. "I need to know if it's real and what it means." "Who gave you this number?" "My cousin, Marcus Aldrin." A pause. The sound of the other end processing. "What's the name?" the man said. "Damien Vale," Ivy said. The silence that followed was not the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone deciding whether they were willing to say what they already knew. "Lady," the man said finally, his voice dropping to something careful and flat. "Whoever you are and whatever you think you're involved in, you're not involved in it. You can't be. People who get involved with Vale don't get uninvolved." "He's been coming to my flower shop every April for 4 years, Ivy said. "I think I might already be involved." Another silence. Longer. "How old's your kid?" the man asked. The question arrived like a fist through a wall. Sudden, structural, leaving a hole that changed the integrity of everything around it. "Why do you ask that?" Ivy's voice was very quiet. "Because if Vale's been coming to your shop every year," the man said slowly, "and you've got a kid, You need to get out of that town tonight. Do you understand me? Not tomorrow. Not after you've thought about it. Tonight." The line went dead. Ivy sat with the phone against her ear for a moment after the call ended, listening to the silence where a voice had been. Then she looked at the laptop screen, at the name, at the photograph beneath it, grainy, clearly taken from distance, a man in a dark coat getting into a black car outside what appeared to be a federal courthouse. The face was unmistakable. She'd been handing him flowers for 4 years. Upstairs, Owen shifted in his sleep. A small sound, a child turning over, completely unaware that the world had just changed shape around him while he dreamed. Ivy closed the laptop. She sat in the dark kitchen and breathed. And then her phone buzzed with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Don't run. Running will bring them to you faster. Stay. Lock the doors. I'm outside." She went to the front window. The black Cadillac was parked at the end of Sycamore Drive. He'd been there the whole time. Ivy stood at the front window for a long time. The Cadillac sat at the end of Sycamore Drive with its lights off and its engine cold, parked just far enough from the nearest street lamp that it occupied a band of shadow between two pools of yellow light. She couldn't see him through the windshield. She could only see the car, the fact of it, the deliberate placement, the particular quality of something that had positioned itself between her house and whatever was coming from the other direction. She read the text again. "Don't run. Running will bring them to you faster. Stay. Lock the doors. I'm outside." Her thumb hovered over the screen. She typed, "How long have you been out there?" The reply came in under 10 seconds. "Since you got home." She stared at that for a moment. Then, "You followed us from the shop?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." She set the phone on the windowsill and pressed both hands flat against the glass and breathed. The glass was cold. The street was empty. Upstairs, Owen was still asleep. She could hear nothing, which meant he hadn't woken, which meant she had some amount of time before this became something she had to explain to a 9-year-old. She picked the phone back up, typed, "Come to the door." A pause. "Longer than the previous ones. Are you sure?" "No," she typed. "Come anyway." She unlocked the front door and stood in the open frame and watched him cross the street. He moved the way he always moved. Contained, deliberate, weight distributed like a man who'd learned to move through spaces without announcing himself. But he was also moving faster than she'd ever seen him move, and when he reached the porch steps and came into the light, she saw it clearly. The lines of his face were drawn tight, the gray eyes running a constant peripheral sweep of the street behind him before they settled on her. "Inside," he said quietly. She stepped back. He came in. She closed and locked the door. They stood in her front hallway, the one with Owen's rain boots by the baseboard and the coat hooks crowded with small jackets and the framed print of a harbor she'd bought at a flea market for $7 because it looked like somewhere she'd rather be. The domesticity of the space had never registered as significant until this exact moment, when the man standing in the middle of it was so comprehensively wrong for it that the contrast was almost physical. "The man I called," Ivy said. "He told me to leave town tonight." Damien's jaw tightened. "Who did you call?" "Someone my cousin gave me, in case of emergencies." She crossed her arms. "He knew your name. He knew it immediately, and it scared him." "What else did he say?" "He asked how old my son was." She watched his face when she said it, watched the specific quality of control it required him to maintain in that moment, the micro-tension in the muscles around his eyes, the half-second before he breathed. "Then he told me to leave tonight." "He's not wrong about the threat," Damien said. "He's wrong about the solution. Running makes it worse. Running makes you visible. You become a moving target instead of a fixed one. Fixed positions can be defended. Moving ones..." He stopped. "I have people in place. 2 vehicles on the main access roads. Someone on the harbor side. You and Owen are safer here tonight than you would be in a car." Ivy studied him. "You set all of this up before you knocked on my shop door this afternoon." "Yes." "You were already protecting us. I was already trying to. Without asking." "Without asking?" he confirmed. He said it without apology, which she noted. Not defiance exactly, more like someone reporting a fact that they weren't going to retroactively reframe as anything other than what it was. She wanted to be angrier than she was. She understood on some level that the anger was the correct response, that a man she didn't know had been monitoring her movements and positioning security around her home was unambiguously a violation regardless of his intentions. She understood that. But Owen was asleep upstairs, and the man who'd told her to run had sounded scared, and the thing that was currently happening was not a thing she could manage alone. "Tell me about Silas Granger," she said. The name landed on Damien the way a fist lands. She saw it, the almost invisible flinch. "Where did you hear that name?" "I searched your name after you left the shop." Damien Vale. "It wasn't hard. You're not invisible." She paused. "Granger's name came up in connection with yours. Some kind of internal conflict. That's what the article said. Internal power conflict within the Vale organization. That was 8 months ago." Damien was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "You searched me," he said. "Of course I searched you. You've been coming to my shop for 4 years, and you've never told me your last name." She held his gaze. "Silas Granger. Tell me." He pulled out his phone without answering, typed something, waited. A response came back, and he read it, and his face went very still. "What?" Ivy said. "The note this morning," he said. "The 2 men Rourke flagged last week. I'd attributed both to Granger's network." He looked up from the phone. "Rourke just confirmed the Volvo from last Thursday is registered to a shell company. The shell company traces back to a holding group." He paused, and the pause had weight. "The holding group is one I set up 7 years ago. It's been dormant for 5 years." Ivy waited. "Someone inside my own organization reactivated it," he said, "and used it to run surveillance on this location. Which means Granger has someone inside my network." He said it with the flat, precise anger of someone naming a structural failure. Not loud, not explosive, but carrying the particular temperature of something that had been contained so long that its controlled release was almost worse than an explosion. "Someone close enough to access dormant infrastructure. Someone I trust." "Do you know who?" "No." He said it like the word cost something. "Not yet." Ivy looked at him, at the phone in his hand, at the way he was standing in her hallway with Owen's rain boots 4 inches from his left foot, running calculations she wasn't party to with a face that had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. "Damien," she said. He looked at her. "Why white tulips?" she said. The shift in him was immediate and total, like watching a fault line move. Every other conversation they'd been having was about logistics, about threat assessment, about the operational geometry of danger and response. This question was not that. This question was something he hadn't prepared a defense for, and she watched the lack of defense register in real time. "That's not," he started. "It's relevant to me," she said. 4 years. Every April, white tulips. Why?" He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at her, which was clearly the hardest of the 3. "I used to know someone," he said, "who loved them." "Used to," she said. "Yes." "Someone you left." His jaw tightened. "Someone I removed myself from to keep them safe." "How'd that work out?" It wasn't kind. She hadn't meant it to be. She watched the words land, and she didn't pull them back. "Not well," he said quietly. "Apparently." The house settled around them. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator cycled on with a low, mechanical hum. Outside, the street was completely still. "I need to tell you something," Damien said, "and I need you to hear the whole thing before you respond." She looked at him steadily. "All right." He didn't look away from her. He'd made a decision. She could see the moment of it, the specific quality of someone committing to a direction after standing at the intersection long enough that staying still had become its own kind of choice. "My name is Damien Vale," he said. "I grew up in Providence." In 2007, I left Seabrook Cove. I left you because a man named Gerald Hatch, who ran the organization I'd been pulled into at 15, told me that if I didn't disappear voluntarily, he would make the people I cared about disappear instead. You were 17. I was 17. I believed him because I had sufficient evidence to believe him. He breathed once, steady. I've thought about that decision every day for 9 years. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm telling you because you deserve to have the information. Ivy was very still. You left because someone threatened me, she said. Yes. And you've been coming back every April because I couldn't stop, he said, simply, without dressing it up. I told myself it was controlled. I told myself 20 minutes once a year was manageable. I was wrong about that. The word wrong from this man, in this hallway, at 11:30 on a Monday night, was such a specific and unexpected thing that it took her a moment to know what to do with it. Then something else arrived. The arithmetic. She'd been keeping it at a distance since Monday afternoon, when Owen had stood in the workroom doorway and said, "His eyes are like mine," with the composure of a child reporting a weather observation. She'd been keeping it at a distance because the distance was the only thing between her and a reckoning she wasn't certain she could survive intact. The distance closed. Owen was born in October, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. 2006. He didn't answer. You left in July 2006, she said. Ivy. He was born in October. She took one step toward him, and she was not tall, and he was not small, but something in the step put them on equal footing in a way that had nothing to do with height. He has your eyes. He has the way you stand, the way you look at things, the way he tilts his head when he's thinking. I've been looking at that for 9 years and telling myself it was coincidence because the alternative, her voice caught. She pressed on through it. The alternative was that you knew and you stayed away anyway. I didn't know, he said. His voice was raw in a way she'd never heard from him. Ivy, I did not know. I found the birth record 4 days ago. The father listed is unknown. A pause that cost him. You wrote unknown. What was I supposed to write? The anger arrived now, finally, full and clean and welcome after the long labor of getting here. You were gone. You were gone, and I was 17 and I was alone and I didn't have a name. I didn't have a number. I didn't have anything. You were just gone. You were just not there anymore. And I had a child and I... She stopped, pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second, pulled it away. I built something. I built this. The shop, the house, Owen. I built all of it, and it works. It holds together. It is ours. And now you're standing in my hallway telling me that some man threatened you into leaving and you've been driving by every April for 4 years and you've known about Owen for 4 days and nobody asked me a single question about what I wanted. The house was very quiet. Damien stood in the middle of it and took what she'd said without deflecting any of it, which was either the right thing to do or the only thing he was capable of. She couldn't tell which. It didn't matter. I know, he said. That's not enough. I know that too. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He looked at it and something happened to his face. Immediate, severe, the kind of shift that has nothing to do with the conversation you're having and everything to do with a different category of emergency. What? She said. Rourke. He was already moving toward the window, pressing flat against the wall beside it, checking the street from the edge of the frame. The vehicle on the harbor side went dark 3 minutes ago. No response. What does that mean? It means someone took him out. He turned from the window. His voice had gone entirely operational, all the previous rawness sealed over with something harder and faster. It means they're already inside the perimeter. Ivy, I need you to get Owen and go to the interior of the house. No windows. Do you have a room with no exterior windows? The hallway bathroom, upstairs. Go there. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. He pulled something from inside his jacket. She registered the shape of it and made herself not react. Do you have anything in the house? For defense. There's a bat in Owen's closet. Get it. Go. Right now. She was already moving, She hit the stairs at a run, not the careful quiet of a mother moving through a sleeping house, but the full-speed, desperate run of someone who had just understood that the thing she'd been treating as abstract had arrived at a specific physical address. She pushed open Owen's door. He was awake, sitting up in bed with wide eyes and the controlled alarm of a child who'd learned not to make noise first and ask questions second. "Mom, up," she said. "Now, bring your blanket." She went to his closet, found the aluminum bat under a pile of board games. Came back. Owen was already on his feet, blanket around his shoulders, watching her with those gray eyes that were very steady for a 9-year-old at 11:30 on a school night. "Is it the man?" he asked. "We're going to the bathroom. Come on." "The man from the shop?" "Owen. He's downstairs," Owen said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way he said everything, as a reported fact, organized and filed. "I heard his voice. He's helping us. Come on." She got him into the hallway bathroom, small, windowless, smelling of Owen's shampoo and the particular domesticity of a shared small space. She locked the door, sat on the floor with her back against the bathtub and pulled Owen down beside her and wrapped one arm around him and held the bat across her knees. Owen sat quietly. His breathing was even. "Mom," he said, "are we in danger?" "We're being careful," she said. "That's not the same as no." "No," she said. "It's not the same as no." He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something. Then he leaned his head against her shoulder and held the blanket with both hands and was quiet. From downstairs, nothing. Then the sound of the back door. Then nothing again. Then, from somewhere outside, a single sharp sound that might have been a car door or might have been something she wasn't going to name in front of her son. Owen's hand found her arm. His fingers wrapped around it. Not tight, not panicked, just present, holding on. They waited. Downstairs, Damien moved through the ground floor in the dark. He knew houses the way he knew most things, from the outside in, cataloging exits before he cataloged anything else. He'd walked Sycamore Drive on foot last week, mid-afternoon, dressed like a man on a phone call who happened to be passing through. He knew the layout of the exterior. He knew the back door opened onto a small yard that backed onto a fence that backed onto the parking lot of a dry cleaner closed after 6. He knew the parking lot was where he'd want to be if he was coming in quiet. He pressed himself against the kitchen wall and waited. His phone buzzed once. Rourke. Back online. Granger's team. 4 confirmed. Entering from Southside. ETA 90 seconds. I have 2 men repositioning. Then, almost immediately, a second message from a number he didn't recognize. He read it twice. He stood in Ivy Rowan's kitchen at 11:40 on a Monday night and read the message twice, and felt something move through him that was not fear and was not anger, but was the specific sensation of a structure you've been standing on, revealing that it had no foundation. The message read, "Did you really think I didn't know about the boy? I've known for 6 months, Damien. I let you have your little Aprils because it kept you predictable. The flower shop, the tulips, the same 20 minutes every year like a man visiting a grave. I let you have it because a man with a ritual is a man I can plan around. But you broke the pattern this week. You went back on Saturday. You went back on Monday. That means you know. Which means the boy is no longer leverage. He's a liability. For both of us. Walk away from the house tonight. Walk away and this ends quietly. Stay, and I'll make sure that child knows exactly what his father is before he dies." It was signed with a single initial. S. Damien had known Silas Granger for 11 years, had trusted him with the architecture of things you only share with someone you believe is structurally committed to the same outcomes you are, had promoted him, protected him, and with the specific retrospective clarity of a man reading a message in a dark kitchen, had fundamentally misread the nature of his loyalty. Granger had known about Owen for 6 months. He'd let Damien keep coming to Seabrook Cove because it made him predictable. He'd been watching the whole time. Damien stood with the phone in his hand and the dark house around him and ran the inventory of everything Granger had access to, every safe house address, every account structure, every operational contact, every piece of information that constituted the architecture of the life Damien had built over 6 years of decisions that had all been made in the sincere belief that distance kept people safe. Distance hadn't kept anyone safe. Distance had just made the exposure invisible. From the back of the house, the soft, deliberate sound of someone testing the door. Damien pocketed the phone, settled his weight, breathed in the careful, measured way that preceded the kind of decision that couldn't be unmade. Then the door came open, and the night came in with it. And the thing he'd been building toward for 9 years, the moment when the architecture of distance collapsed entirely and left only the irreducible question of what he was willing to do, arrived in his kitchen at the end of Sycamore Drive with the quiet, terrible efficiency of something that had been on its way for a very long time. The first man through the door was large and professional and made the specific mistake of not accounting for the fact that Damien was already positioned for exactly this entry point. The second man stayed outside, which was a decision that told Damien 2 things. There were more in front, and they wanted him flushed toward the street. He didn't move toward the street. He moved forward. The next 90 seconds were not clean and not quiet, and the kitchen bore evidence of both. Damien came through it with a split lip and 2 cracked knuckles on his right hand, and the absolute cold clarity that arrives in human beings when the options have narrowed to a single point, and the point is survival. He had 2 men down, 2, at minimum, outside. He had a woman and a child in a bathroom upstairs. He had a message from a man he'd trusted for 11 years telling him that the child's life was conditional on Damien's withdrawal. He stood in the kitchen breathing carefully and processed all of this. And what came out the other side of the processing was not strategy exactly. It was simpler than strategy, more fundamental than calculation. He was not leaving. He pulled out his phone, called Rourke. Full extraction protocol. Not for me, for the woman and the boy. Get them out of the house through the front in the next 3 minutes. You take them personally. You don't hand them to anyone else. Do you understand? And you? Rourke said. I'm going to call Granger. A pause. Damien, he wants me isolated. I'm going to give him isolated. Get Ivy and Owen out while his attention is on me. He ended the call before Rourke could argue. He typed a response to Granger's message. 3 words. Come in yourself. The reply was almost instant. Now we're having a real conversation. Then from upstairs, the sound of footsteps. Ivy at the top of the stairs, bat in hand, Owen behind her with the blanket still around his shoulders. Both of them looking down at him in the dark with the specific quality of people who'd heard enough through a locked bathroom door to know that the situation had changed and that changing with it was the only available option. There's a man coming to the front, Damien said, looking up at them. His name is Rourke. He works for me. He's going to take you somewhere safe. Ivy looked at him. And you? I'll follow. That's not what follow means when someone says it like that. She was right, and they both knew it. Ivy. He held her gaze. I need you to take Owen and go with Rourke. Right now. I need to know you're both out of this house before I do what I have to do next. Owen spoke from behind his mother, voice perfectly steady for a child standing in a dark stairwell in the middle of the night. Are you our father? The question arrived the way certain questions do, with the absolute certainty of something that had been true before anyone said it out loud, and whose saying out loud did not create it but simply acknowledged what had been structurally present the entire time. Damien looked at him, at the gray eyes, the set of the jaw, the particular stillness. Yes, he said. Owen absorbed this with a single nod, the way he absorbed everything, efficiently, without performance. Okay, he said, and then to his mother. We should go. Ivy stood on the stairs and looked at Damien for a long moment. Her face was doing something he didn't have the vocabulary for, holding too many things at once, the way a person looks when the life they built and the life they were supposed to have are occupying the same physical space, and there's no way to determine, in this moment, which one is real. Don't die, she said. It wasn't tender. It was direct and a little rough around the edges, and it was the most honest thing she could have said, and they both knew it. Working on it, he said. The knock at the front door. Rourke's signal, 2 short and 1 long. Ivy came down the stairs. She passed him close enough that he could have reached out, close enough that the distance between them was the same distance that had existed for 9 years. present, deliberate, carrying the specific weight of everything that had been decided and everything that hadn't. She didn't reach for him. He didn't reach for her. Owen, passing, stopped for exactly 1 second and looked up at Damien with those eyes. "Be careful," he said. Then he followed his mother to the door, and Rourke's voice came through low and steady from the porch, and they were gone. Damien stood in the empty house. He picked up his phone and called Silas Granger's direct line. Not the message chain, the actual number, the one that meant this is not a negotiation, this is an arrival. Granger answered on the second ring. "You sent your family away," Granger said. Not surprised. Approving, almost. The tone of a man watching a chess piece move where he'd predicted. "Yes," Damien said. "Smart. The men you sent through my back door aren't coming back out." A brief silence. "I have more." "I know." Damien moved through the kitchen toward the rear of the house. "Silas, you've known about the boy for 6 months. 7, actually. I rounded down. And you didn't move on it. I didn't need to. You were predictable. April, Seabrook Cove, 20 minutes, back to Providence. Like a man who needed to see the grave to remember why he was still alive." Granger's voice was almost conversational. "Then you broke the pattern, twice. Which told me you knew. Which told me the leverage was about to expire. Can't blame me for updating my position." "Who's inside my network?" Damien said. Silence. "You already know," Granger said. "You've known for a while, you just didn't want it to be true." Damien stopped walking. He stood in the dark kitchen and ran the name through everything. Every meeting, every conversation, every piece of information that had moved in directions he'd attributed to operational gaps rather than deliberate leaks. There was only one person it could be. The person who'd been with him longest. The person who'd run the security protocols for every location he visited with any regularity. The person who'd flagged the blue Volvo, who'd run the cross-check, who'd reported the harborside vehicle going dark 3 minutes before the breach. Just long enough to give Damien a warning, just short enough that the warning felt like intelligence rather than management. Rourke. Rourke, who was currently driving Ivy and Owen to a location that Silas Granger already knew. Damien was already running. He went out the back, over the fence, across the dry cleaner's parking lot, cutting left onto Birch Street at a dead run with the phone already in his hand and Rourke's number already dialing. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which told him everything the ring count would have told him anyway. Rourke had seen the call coming and made a decision about it. Damien ended the call and ran harder. He didn't know the extraction route. That was the problem. The specific, catastrophic problem that he was now sprinting through. Extraction protocols were Rourke's architecture. Damien had approved them in principle and delegated the specifics because delegation was how you scaled, because you couldn't build the kind of operation he'd built without trusting people with operational details you didn't micromanage, and the cost of that trust was running through him now, like a current. He stopped at the corner of Birch and Crestwood and pulled up the tracking app on his phone, the one that ran passively on all vehicles in his network. He found Rourke's SUV. It was moving north on Harbor Road, away from the residential grid, toward the industrial waterfront. Not toward any safe house Damien knew about. Toward the shipping terminal. He stood on the corner breathing hard and processed this with the speed that high-stakes situations demand. Not thinking it through exactly, but letting the architecture of it resolve at a rate that was closer to physical than intellectual. Granger wanted Damien isolated. Rourke was bringing Ivy and Owen to Granger rather than away from him, which meant either Rourke had been Granger's contact from the beginning, years possibly, or Granger had acquired him recently, through the specific categories of leverage that Damien understood intimately and had never thought to apply in Rourke's direction because Rourke was the person he trusted to think about that kind of thing. He called the one number he had left. It rang twice. A woman answered. "I need a vehicle and a location," Damien said. "Right now. Harbor Road, North End." "Who is this?" the woman said, which was its own kind of answer. She knew exactly who it was. "Someone who needs a vehicle," he said. "Elena." A pause. Elena Vasquez had been a peripheral contact for 4 years. Not organization, not affiliated. The specific category of person who existed at the edges of his world by choice and provided assistance on a strictly transactional basis. She was the kind of contact you kept precisely because she had no loyalty to anyone's internal politics. "There's a blue pickup on Cannery Row," she said. "Unlocked. Keys above the visor. You didn't get it from me." "I never do." He was already moving. Cannery Row was 6 blocks. He covered them in under 4 minutes, which was not a speed his body was particularly grateful for, given that he'd spent the last 20 minutes in a kitchen fight that had left his right hand wrong in ways he was deliberately not examining. He found the truck, an ancient Ford with rust along the wheel wells and a cracked passenger mirror, and got in and had the engine running before he'd fully closed the door. Harbor Road North. The shipping terminal was 2 miles out, past the working waterfront, where the industrial infrastructure of the harbor gave way to the older infrastructure of a shipping industry that had been in decline since the 90s. Warehouses, loading docks, a container yard that operated at maybe 30% capacity, the kind of place with enough space and enough abandonment to be useful for the specific category of meeting that couldn't happen anywhere else. Damien drove without lights until he hit the service road that ran along the terminal's east perimeter. He parked behind a corrugated steel warehouse that had been out of operation long enough to have a tree growing through a gap in the loading dock. Went the rest of the way on foot, staying against the building line, testing the ground for loose material before each step. He could hear them before he saw them. Voices. Not shouting, which was almost worse. The specific register of people who had the situation sufficiently under control that they didn't need to raise their voices. A door opened somewhere, letting yellow light fan out across wet asphalt. He worked toward it, using the container stacks for cover, staying low, ignoring the thing his right hand was doing when he put weight through it. He reached the corner of the main terminal building and looked through a gap in the corrugated wall. The space inside was enormous. Ceiling 40 feet up, lit by work lights mounted on stands, casting everything in a harsh industrial white that made shadows sharp and faces look like things from which the softness had been deliberately removed. Shipping containers were stacked 3 and 4 high along the walls, leaving a central floor space of maybe 60 feet across. Rourke was standing near the center. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and the posture of a man who was comfortable, a man who'd arrived at a conclusion and had been living with it long enough that the discomfort had metabolized. Ivy was 10 feet from Rourke, standing, not restrained, technically, but there were 2 men positioned in ways that made the standing a formality. She had Owen's arm in her hand, Owen pressed to her side, and she was doing the thing Damien had seen her do in the flower shop when she'd read the note, holding completely still, conserving everything, not giving anything away until she knew where to spend it. Owen was looking at the ceiling, at the structural supports, at the container stacks, at the exits. He was 9 years old and he was doing a reconnaissance survey of the room, and the specificity of that hit Damien somewhere that had nothing to do with the operational situation and everything to do with the fact that genetics are a strange and merciless accountant. Then Silas Granger walked in from the far side of the building. Damien hadn't seen Granger in 8 months. Their last meeting had been in Boston, a quarterly review. The kind of meeting that had been normal for years and that Damien was now retroactively rereading with the specific horror of someone who'd thought they were playing chess and discovers they were actually the board. Granger was 52, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and the face of someone who'd made a professional discipline of looking reasonable. He wore a dark overcoat. He walked unhurried. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at Ivy and Owen with an expression that Damien, watching through the gap in the wall, could only describe as administrative, the look of someone assessing the condition of assets that had arrived within specification. "Mrs. Rowan," Granger said. "I'm not married," Ivy said. Granger's mouth moved slightly. "Ms. Rowan, you have about 3 seconds to tell me where this is going before I start making noise." Rourke shifted. One of the flanking men shifted. Granger raised a hand and both of them went still again. "The noise would be counterproductive," Granger said, "and unnecessary. You and the boy are not the objective here." "Then why are we here?" "Because Damien Vale needs a reason to come through a door," Granger said simply. "You're the reason." Ivy was quiet for a moment. "He's not coming," she said. "He told us to run." "He told Rourke to take you somewhere safe," Granger said. which is not the same as running, and Damien Vale doesn't run. He'll be here. He checked his watch. 12 minutes, I'd estimate. He's on foot or in a borrowed vehicle. He doesn't have backup because Rourke was his backup. And he knows this location because he's been tracking the SUV since you left the house. He looked up. He's a predictable man when the thing he cares about is in a room. Owen said without inflection, "He's already here." Every head in the room turned toward the boy. Owen was still looking at the far wall, the corrugated section with the gap in the lower panel, the one Damien was pressed against 30 feet away. "He's been here for about 2 minutes, Owen said. He said it with the same calm specificity with which he'd reported that the Cadillac's windows were tinted, and that his eyes were like the stranger's, and that they should go. Just information. Just the world, organized and reported. The room went very still. Damien made a decision and stopped making it at the same moment, which is to say that he stopped being someone who was making decisions and became instead someone who was moving. He went through the gap in the corrugated wall at speed, coming in low, and the first flanking man was turning toward the sound when Damien's shoulder hit his sternum and drove him back into the container stack with an impact that echoed off the terminal ceiling like a gunshot. The second flanking man went for a weapon. "Don't!" Rourke's voice, flat and hard. Not directed at Damien, directed at the flanking man. Both Damien and the flanking man registered this simultaneously, and both of them stopped. Rourke had his weapon out. It was pointed at the flanking man. The room reorganized itself. Granger stood in the center with the expression of someone watching a variable perform unexpectedly. Rourke was now positioned laterally, weapon covering the flanking men rather than Ivy and Owen. Ivy had pulled Owen another step back, putting a container corner between them and the open center of the room. Damien was on his feet, breathing hard, right hand wrong in multiple ways. Blood on his jacket from the kitchen and newer blood from the corrugated wall edge he'd come through. "Rourke," Granger said. His voice had changed. The administrative quality was gone, something colder underneath. "I've been in your pocket for 2 years, Rourke said, not looking at Granger, eyes moving between the flanking men. "You want to know what it cost you? I know every approach you've planned, every contact you used, every location." He paused. "I fed it to Damien an hour ago." Granger looked at him. "You fed it to Damien?" Text message, encrypted, the full network map. "You've been running a counter-operation inside mine," Granger said. "You recruited me from his team," Rourke said. "Did you actually think I stopped being his?" The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't feel silent. It had texture and temperature, the specific quality of a moment in which multiple people are processing a betrayal and arriving at different conclusions about what to do with it at very different speeds. Granger moved first, not toward Rourke, not toward Damien. He moved toward Owen. It was fast, faster than his age suggested. The movement of a man who'd decided on this outcome before he walked into the room and had been waiting for the moment of maximum disruption to execute it. He covered the distance before anyone had fully processed the direction of his intent. His hand caught Owen's arm. He pulled the boy in front of him and took 3 steps back until his shoulders were against a container wall. Owen didn't make a sound. He went rigid, not struggling, not crying, just completely rigid, like a kid who'd decided that stillness was the most information he could offer the adults who were supposed to be handling this. Ivy moved. Damien caught her arm. "Don't. Let go of me. Ivy." His voice was very quiet and very controlled and very close to the edge of something he was maintaining by a margin that had no room for movement. "Don't. Look at me. Don't look at him." She looked at Damien instead. Her eyes were bright and terrible, and she was shaking under his hand. Granger held Owen against the container wall with one hand on the boy's shoulder. Not violent, which was somehow worse. Clinical. The grip of someone who understood how to make a point without making marks. "Here's where we are," Granger said. "Rourke's betrayal is noted and will be addressed. The network map he sent you is incomplete. He doesn't have access to the offshore architecture, and you know that." He looked at Damien steadily. "The boy comes with me. Leverage against you, leverage against the Coast operation, leverage against the 2 federal investigators who've been building a case for the last 18 months that you know nothing about because I've been managing them. He comes with me, and in exchange you retire. Fully. The organization passes to my management. You go wherever people like you go when they're finished, and the child is returned when the transition is stable. When it's stable, Damien said. 6 months, a year at most. No, Damien said. Granger's hand tightened on Owen's shoulder. Owen made a small, involuntary sound, the first sound he'd made, and Ivy's whole body moved against Damien's grip like a current through a wire. You don't have a strong negotiating position here, Granger said. I'm not negotiating, Damien said. He released Ivy's arm. He walked toward Granger. Damien! Rourke's voice, warning register. He kept walking. Granger watched him come with the expression of someone recalculating. Stop. Damien didn't stop. I will hurt the boy. No, Damien said, still walking. You won't, because hurting the boy destroys the leverage, and the leverage is the only thing you have that I care about more than getting to you. He was 15 feet away. 10. You need him intact, which means right now in this room you have one option, and it's the one where we talk about what I'm actually willing to give you. And if you hurt him before we have that conversation, you have nothing. He stopped 6 feet from Granger. Owen was looking at him, the gray eyes steady, the jaw set, the breathing controlled in a way that was so precisely like looking in a mirror that it was almost unbearable. What are you willing to give me? Granger said. Everything, Damien said. Accounts, infrastructure, operational contacts, the offshore architecture Rourke doesn't have, the ledgers you've been trying to find for 3 years. All of it, complete and verified. Granger studied him. In exchange for the boy, the woman, and you leave Seabrook Cove permanently. That's the whole empire, Granger said. Yes. You'd burn everything you built. Yes. Why would you do that? Damien looked at him. He said it the way he said things when the pretense of strategy had been exhausted and the thing underneath was all that was left. Because I built it wrong, he said, and I'm done. Granger was quiet. He was running numbers. Damien could see it, the precise calculation behind the reasonable face, weighing the offer against the variables, checking it for traps the way a man like Granger checked everything for traps, because a man like Granger had built his entire architecture on the assumption that generosity was always a vector for something else. It was taking too long. Damien watched Granger's eyes shift, just slightly, just a flicker toward something over Damien's right shoulder, and moved. He closed the distance in 2 steps, got his left hand on Granger's wrist, and pulled Owen out of his grip in the same motion. He turned his body so Owen came out on the far side of him, away from Granger, and shoved him hard enough in the direction of the container corner where Ivy was waiting. Granger recovered faster than expected. The compact body, the professional training, and what he pulled from inside his coat was small and very deliberate and pointed at Damien's chest from a distance of 3 feet. Don't, Granger said. Damien stood between him and Owen. Last offer, Damien said. He was breathing hard. His right hand was bad enough now that he couldn't have made a useful fist with it if he'd wanted to, and he'd taken something across the ribs in the kitchen that was making full breath of negotiation. He stood in the industrial light and looked at Granger and held the ground between this man and his son. Walk out. I'll have the account access sent to you within 24 hours. This ends tonight, and nobody else gets involved. You shot 2 of my men in your kitchen, Granger said. They'll live. I was careful. Careful. Granger's mouth twisted. 12 years, Damien. We built this together. You tried to use my son, Damien said. There's no version of 12 years that survives that. Something moved in Granger's face. Not regret, not quite. More like the look of a man closing an account, moving a number from one column to another, finalizing a ledger entry that had been provisional for longer than was operationally advisable. Then, from the far side of the terminal, the lights went on. Not work lights. External floods, the kind mounted to vehicles, multiple of them, filling the terminal with white light so comprehensive and sudden that everyone in the room went still and squinted against it simultaneously like animals caught in an open field. A voice amplified from outside. This is a federal instruction. Everyone in the building, do not move. Granger's face changed completely. The federal investigators, Damien said quietly, the ones you said you'd been managing. Granger looked at him. Rourke sent them the network map, Damien said. An hour ago, the same time he sent it to me. He watched Granger absorb this. Watched the specific quality of realization travel through a man who had spent 11 years being the person in the room who knew the most. The look of someone discovering, at the moment it was too late to matter, that they'd been outpaced. The offshore architecture you said he didn't have access to. He's had access for 4 months. I gave it to him. Because I've been building toward this for 8 months, Silas. Since I figured out someone inside my network was running product to Granger's offshore accounts. I just didn't know it was Rourke running it as a double, feeding you what you needed and building the federal case at the same time. He paused. You were right that I'm predictable. You were wrong about what I was being predictable toward. Granger stood with the weapon still in his hand and the federal floods filling the terminal, and Rourke already moving toward the building's side exit, and the two flanking men looking at each other with the expressions of people who had just begun the calculation of whether loyalty was worth the specific mathematics of a federal charge. You gave up the Empire, Granger said. I gave the Empire to the Federals 8 months ago, Damien said. I've been running an empty shell since February, making it look like business as usual while Rourke built the case file. He held Granger's gaze. Everything you thought you were taking over was already gone. The weapon was still up, 3 feet. Damien could see Granger's knuckles, the tension in the wrist. If you fire that, Damien said quietly, there are 12 federal agents on the other side of those doors. You become a man who shot someone in front of 12 federal witnesses. That's not survivable legally, not even close. He let that sit for a second. Put it down, Silas. From the container corner, a sound he hadn't expected. Owen's voice, very quiet, directed not at Granger, but at Damien. Dad, Owen said. One word, his son's voice, using that word for the first time, in a shipping terminal in the middle of the night, which was so comprehensively wrong as a setting for the most significant thing that had ever been said to him that Damien almost laughed. Almost. He didn't take his eyes off Granger, but something in his face changed. He felt it change. The specific relaxation of something that had been held for so long under so much pressure that its release was almost structural, like a building settling after an earthquake. I hear you, he said. Granger lowered the weapon. Not dropped. Lowered. Controlled, deliberate. The movement of a man who had decided which outcome was least bad, and was enacting it with the dignity of someone who'd spent 50 years refusing to look like he was losing. He set the weapon on the ground and straightened and put his hands out to his sides. The terminal doors came open. Federal agents came through in the specific organized way of people who've practiced the entry point for a location in advance. They moved past Damien, past Granger, filling the space with the controlled efficiency of an operation that had been planned well and was now simply executing. Damien turned around. Ivy was at the container corner with Owen's face pressed against her shoulder, one arm around him, the other hand still holding the aluminum bat, with a white-knuckled grip that suggested she'd completely forgotten she was holding it. She was looking at Damien over the top of Owen's head. He walked to her. He stopped 2 feet away. The distance that had been his default for 9 years, as the distance he'd maintained in the shop, on the street, in her hallway, in every interaction that had been about containment and management and the structured denial of what he actually wanted. Owen turned from his mother's shoulder and looked at him. His face was flushed and his eyes were too bright, and he looked for the first time like an actual 9-year-old who had had an actual terrible night and was holding himself together through the specific stubbornness of a child who decided that falling apart was not an option. You okay? Damien asked him. Owen considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. My shoulder hurts, he said. Where he grabbed it. I know, I'm sorry. It's not your fault. It is, actually. A lot of it is. He met the boy's eyes. But we can talk about that when you're not standing in a warehouse at midnight. Owen nodded. Okay. Damien looked at Ivy. She was still holding the bat. Her hair was loose and her face was pale under the work lights, and she'd been through something tonight that no framing made acceptable. And she was standing upright, and had been standing upright through all of it with the specific posture of someone who had not once, in Damien's observation, allowed herself to collapse simply because the situation was making a compelling case for it. "Ivy?" he said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to—" "I know what you were going to say, and I need you to not say it yet." Her voice was not steady, but it was functional. "I need you to not say anything that requires me to feel something right now, because if I start feeling something, I'm going to stop functioning, and I cannot stop functioning until Owen is somewhere safe and warm, and I have had approximately 4 hours of sleep and a very large amount of coffee." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "After that," she said, "we will have a conversation, a long one, about everything." "Yes." "And you will not leave in the middle of it." "No." She looked at him for a long moment. The federal agents were moving around them. Voices, radio traffic, the specific organized noise of an operation in progress. Granger was being walked toward the terminal doors with his hands behind his back and the dignified expression of a man committed to not looking like what he was. Rourke was standing near the side exit, talking to a federal agent with the demeanor of someone who had been waiting for this specific conversation and was relieved to finally be having it. The world was doing what the world does when the acute phase ends. Reorganizing, processing, beginning the long administrative work of aftermath. And in the middle of it, in a shipping terminal at the edge of Seabrook Cove Harbor, Ivy Rowan reached out and took the hem of Damien's jacket in one hand. Not his hand, not his arm, mushroom, just the fabric, just the edge of him, and held it the way you hold something you're not ready to let go of, but aren't yet ready to claim. Owen, standing between them, looked at her hand on the jacket, then at Damien, then at the harbor visible through the open terminal doors, the black water, the light on it, the boats that had been going out every morning for as long as any of them had been alive, indifferent and constant. "Can we go home now?" he asked. Damien looked at the harbor, then at the boy, then at the woman holding the edge of his jacket in the middle of everything that had just happened and everything that still had to be said. "Yeah," he said. They didn't go home that night. Home, the blue house on Sycamore Drive, was a crime scene in the technical sense, which meant it was taped and lit and populated by people with clipboards and evidence bags who needed the kitchen for several hours before anyone could reasonably inhabit it again. A federal agent named Sorrel, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair, and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been running a case for 18 months and was now managing its resolution in real time, met Damien at the terminal doors and told him this with the brisk courtesy of someone who understood that the people she was talking to had been through something significant and did not need it elaborated on. "We'll need statements," she said, "from you and from Ms. Rowan. Not tonight, tomorrow if she's able." "She's able," Ivy said from beside Damien, which was the first thing she'd said to anyone in a federal capacity, and she said it with a flatness that discouraged follow-up questions. Sorrel looked at Owen, who was standing between his parents with his blanket still around his shoulders and dirt on his knees from the terminal floor, and the expression of a child processing a large amount of information at a rate that was impressive and slightly alarming. "Is there somewhere you can take them tonight?" Sorrel asked Damien. "Yes," he said, though he didn't have a location yet. Every safe house he'd maintained was now federal property, in all but paperwork. He'd think of something. He'd been thinking of something under worse conditions than this for 15 years. He thought of it in the parking lot while Ivy buckled Owen into the back seat of a vehicle Sorrel had arranged, a plain sedan, anonymous, driven by an agent who would stay with them until morning. Damien stood outside the driver's door and called a number he hadn't used in 2 years, a man named Carver, who owned a fishing cabin 20 minutes up the coast, and who owed Damien a favor that predated every organizational complexity by enough years to be clean. Carver answered on the third ring, groggy and confused, and was significantly less confused after 30 seconds of Damien explaining what he needed and why. The cabin would be unlocked. The key was under the third porch step. There was food in the freezer and wood beside the door. "You all right?" Carver asked, with the blunt concern of a man who didn't do emotional elaboration. "Working on it," Damien said. He got in the car. The drive up the coast took 23 minutes. Owen fell asleep in the back seat within the first 5, which was the specific mercy of children, the capacity to find unconsciousness, even when the world had recently been doing its worst. Ivy sat beside him with one hand on his knee and watched the dark water through the window and didn't speak. Damien sat in the front passenger seat and watched the road and let the silence be what it needed to be. The cabin was small and smelled of wood smoke and salt and the specific staleness of a space that had been closed for winter and not yet opened for spring. Damien found the key under the step and got the door open and turned on the lamps while Ivy carried Owen inside. The boy heavy and loose in sleep, his head against her shoulder, the blanket trailing. She put him on the couch and covered him and stood over him for a moment with her hand on his hair. Just standing, just that. Then she walked to the kitchen table and sat down. Damien put water on for coffee because it was something to do with his hands, and because it was 4 a.m. and there was no version of the conversation they were about to have that he wanted to have without something to hold. He found mugs on the second shelf, found coffee in a sealed canister, found the specific ordinary comfort of a task that required only the knowledge of how kitchens worked. He set a mug in front of her and sat across the table. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the surface of the coffee. "Tell me all of it," she said. "From the beginning." So he did. He told her about Gerald Hatch, the man who'd run the Providence operation that Damien had been pulled into at 15 through the specific gravitational pull of poverty and proximity, the way those two things combined to make certain options feel like the only options. He told her about the escalating involvement, the years of making himself useful, because useful people didn't get discarded, the way ambition and survival had become indistinguishable from each other at an age when most people were deciding what to study in college. He told her about July 2006. About Hatch sitting across from him in a booth at a diner outside Providence and laying out the terms with the same casual efficiency with which he might have discussed a supply chain problem. The girl in Seabrook Cove. The family business. Her grandmother's shop. The old woman who'd built it from a boathouse and who had bad knees and no insurance. The specific, incredible nature of what Hatch was describing. Damien had been 17. He'd sat in that booth and done the calculation that 17-year-olds should never be required to do, and the calculation had come out the same way every time he ran it. "He would have hurt you," Damien said, not as a defense, as a reported fact. "I know," Ivy said. "I didn't have a way to stop him that didn't involve... I wasn't in a position yet where..." He stopped, started again. "I left because leaving was the only lever I had. The only thing I could give him that he wanted more than hurting someone." "Your absence," Ivy said. "My compliance." He looked at his coffee. "Same thing, in his framework." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you know, when you left, that I was... Did you have any idea?" "No," he said. "I didn't know until 4 days ago." She nodded slowly. She'd asked and received the answer she'd probably already arrived at, but there was a difference between arriving at something and having it confirmed, and she was sitting with that difference now. "I wrote unknown," she said, "on the birth record." "I know. I wrote it because I didn't have a name that meant anything legally, and I didn't have a location, and I was 17 and alone, and my grandmother had just had a bad fall, and there were about 9 things that were more immediately urgent than filling in a line on a form for a person who'd stopped existing." She looked up at him. "I wasn't trying to erase you. I want you to know that. I was just surviving." "I know," he said. "Owen has your eyes," she said. "I know. He's had them his whole life." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite grief, but the thing that lives between the two when you've been carrying it alone long enough that its weight has become structural. "I looked at him every single day and told myself I was seeing what I wanted to see, that I was pattern matching out of some unresolved. I told myself a lot of things." "So did I," Damien said. She looked at him directly. The lamplight in the cabin was warm and low, and it made her face look the way he'd stored it for 9 years. Not younger exactly, but closer to the version that had been laid down before life had gotten its full weight behind it. "I'm angry," she said. "I want you to understand that I'm angry. Not at the situation. At you." "Yes. You came back every April and you bought flowers and you left and you never once..." She stopped. Her hands tightened on the mug. "I had a baby alone. I built a business alone. I raised a child alone, Damien, and you were 20 minutes up the coast every April buying tulips and calculating risk and deciding that 20 minutes of proximity was what I got while you managed the fallout of a life I never asked to be adjacent to. Yes, he said. That's what you have to say. No, I have a great deal more to say, and none of it is sufficient. He looked at her. I made decisions on your behalf without consulting you. I decided what you needed and what you could handle, and I was wrong. Not about the danger. The danger was real, and it found you anyway, which I'll carry for the rest of my life. But I was wrong about what you deserved to know, and wrong about what you were capable of, and wrong about letting another 9 years pass while I drove up once a year and told myself that containment was the same thing as care. He held her gaze. There is no version of an apology that is proportionate to that. I'm aware of that. I'm not offering one as a transaction. Then what are you offering? He thought about it, genuinely. Not the prepared answer, not the operational response. The actual answer, arrived at in real time in a fishing cabin at 4 a.m. with his son asleep 10 feet away and the woman he'd loved since he was 16 sitting across a kitchen table from him in the posture of someone who had every right to stand up and walk out and who was still sitting. Accountability, he said. Whatever you need from me going forward, Owen, whatever role you decide is appropriate, I'll take. If that's no role, I'll take that too, and I won't make it about what I want. He paused. And I'm done. The organization is dismantled. The federal case is built. Whatever's left of what I built is in Sorrel's hands. I have approximately nothing left in the operational sense, which is, it's the first time in 15 years that's been true. You gave it all up, she said. 8 months ago, he said. I started building the case 8 months ago when I realized Granger was moving against me. I could have handled it internally. I didn't. I chose to give the whole thing to the Federals and let it end. He looked at his hands on the table. April was the reason. I kept driving up here once a year, and the thing I'd told myself was contained was not contained, and I was tired of pretending it was. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to come home. I didn't know how to do it from inside what I was. Ivy sat with that for a long time. Outside, the ocean moved the way it always moved, indifferent to time and schedule and the specific human dramas playing out in its proximity. The lamp made a small circle of warmth. Owen breathed evenly on the couch. He said, Dad, Ivy said. Yes. In the warehouse. Yes. He'd never said that to anyone before. She looked at the sleeping boy. He's never asked about his father. Not directly. He used to ask me things when he was about 6, 7, not about a specific person, just about the concept, why some kids had dads and he didn't. I gave him the answers I had, which were limited. She turned back. He's been waiting a long time for a shape to put to it. I know. Something in Damien's voice that hadn't been there before, raw, less managed. I heard him say it, and I didn't know what to do with it. I still don't. You learn, Ivy said. That's all it is. You show up, and you're wrong about things, and you learn. She looked at him steadily. He's not easy, by the way. He's serious, and he notices everything, and he has opinions about things that will stop you cold. Last month he told me that my bookkeeping system was structurally inefficient and drew me a diagram. Damien was quiet for a second. A diagram. On graph paper, labeled. Something moved across his face that was not yet a smile, but was the thing a smile comes from. He reorganized my seed inventory when he was 7, Ivy continued, by genus and then by bloom season. He's 9, and he knows what genus means. He's going to be terrifying, Damien said. He already is, Ivy said, and there it was. Not a resolution, not a forgiveness rendered in full, but the first shared moment that existed in the present tense rather than the past. A small thing. The size of a sentence about a boy with graph paper and strong opinions about bookkeeping. She let it exist for a moment. Then she said, I'm not ready to tell you that everything is fine, because it's not fine. We have a very long way to go, and most of it is going to be uncomfortable, and some of it is going to be genuinely hard, and I don't know yet what I want the shape of it to be. I know. But I'm not asking you to leave. The words landed with the specific weight of things said quietly that carry more than their syllable count. He sat with them and didn't fill the space around them with anything. "Okay," he said. "That's not a promise," she said. "It's just tonight. You can stay tonight." "That's enough," he said. And he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with management or strategy. The straightforward meaning of someone who had spent a long time with not enough and understood what it was. She stood up, took her coffee, went to the couch and sat at the end of it near Owen's feet and pulled a blanket from the back of the couch around her shoulders. She was asleep within 10 minutes, the specific unconsciousness of absolute exhaustion, her head tipped against the couch back and her coffee on the floor beside her. Damien sat at the table for a while longer. Then he moved to the chair near the window and sat there in the dark watching the two of them sleep. The woman and the boy, his son's chest rising and falling with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and all the time that existed to be there. He didn't sleep. He sat with the night and let it pass. The federal process took 4 months. Damien's statement ran to 47 pages. The testimony sessions were held in a building in Boston that smelled of industrial carpet and recycled air, and Agent Sorrell ran them with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting a long time for the evidence to catch up to what she already understood and was not going to waste the opportunity. Damien answered every question directly. He didn't minimize and he didn't deflect, and on the 4th session, when Sorrell's co-agent, a younger man named Pell, who had the aggressive energy of someone trying to prove something, pushed him on the human cost of certain operations, Damien sat with the question for a long moment and then answered it honestly and completely, which was not what Pell had been expecting and was, for that reason, more effective than any evasion would have been. Silas Granger was arraigned in May. The charges were extensive and the evidence was comprehensive, and his legal team spent 3 weeks looking for structural weaknesses in the case before advising him that the structural weaknesses were not present. He pled in June. The sentencing was scheduled for September. Rourke's cooperation was extensive, and his deal reflected that. He was not a free man when it was over, but he was a man with a defined horizon, which was more than the alternative. On the day his plea was entered, he sent Damien a text message that read, "I was always yours, not his. I want you to know that." Damien read it twice and then replied, "I know." Because he did know now, had assembled the timeline over the 4 months of process, and understood the architecture of what Rourke had been doing and why. And the understanding didn't simplify the anger, but it complicated it sufficiently that what remained was closer to grief than fury. He drove to Seabrook Cove on a Thursday in June. Not April. Not the ritual date. Not 20 minutes and a parking spot on Whitmore Lane. He drove up on a Thursday because Ivy had called him the previous Sunday and told him that Owen had a baseball game at the elementary school field, and that if he wanted to come, he was welcome to, and that there was no obligation, and she wasn't calling it anything. He came. He sat in the second row of the metal bleachers with parents he didn't know on either side of him, and watched his son play third base with the particular focused competence that Damien was learning to recognize as Owen's default mode, regardless of the activity. The boy was not the most athletic kid on the field. He was, however, the one who consistently made the right decision about where to throw the ball, and in the 4th inning he made a play that required him to field a line drive, pivot, and throw to second to catch a runner who'd broken early, a play that required about 3 separate calculations in under 2 seconds, and he made it look routine. Damien sat in the bleachers with his hands on his knees and felt something in his chest that he didn't have a precise word for. It was not pride exactly, though it was adjacent to pride. It was more like recognition, the specific sensation of seeing something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking for it, and having it resolve from abstract to concrete in the length of one baseball play on a Thursday afternoon in June. Ivy was 2 rows up. She'd waved when he arrived and then gone back to watching the game, which was exactly the right calibration for where they were. Acknowledged, unforced, given room to be whatever it was. Owen saw him in the 3rd inning, made eye contact from third base with the alert stillness of a kid who'd spotted something relevant and was deciding what to do with it. Gave a single nod, The specific nod Damien was beginning to recognize as Owen's version of a range of things that other people expressed with more syllables. Then went back to playing baseball. After the game, walking to the parking lot, Owen fell into step beside Damien without being prompted. They walked for a moment in the way that two people walk when they're still learning the distance between them. "Good play in the fourth," Damien said. "I almost threw it too early," Owen said. "I had to wait an extra half second." "I know, you waited." "It's hard to wait when every instinct is telling you to throw." "Yes," Damien said. "It is." Owen considered this. Is that something you know about? Waiting when the instinct says go?" Damien looked at the boy walking beside him, 9 years old, serious, asking with genuine curiosity the kind of question that adults spent years learning how to ask. "Yeah," he said, "I know about that." "Did you get better at it?" Damien thought about 9 years of April Tuesdays, about white tulips and 20 minutes and the systematic management of everything he couldn't afford to want. About the specific discipline of arriving at the edge of something and turning back every year, year after year, until the turning back had become its own kind of trap. "No," he said honestly. "I got worse at it. And then I stopped trying to be good at it, and that turned out to be better." Owen absorbed this with his characteristic efficiency. Nodded once. They reached the parking lot. "Will you come to the next game?" Owen asked. He said it the way he said things, looking at the middle distance, not at Damien, the way of a kid who'd learned to ask for things sideways because straight-on asking had outcomes that were harder to manage. "Yes," Damien said. Owen nodded again, started toward Ivy's van, stopped. "I don't know what to call you," he said. He turned around for this part, the gray eyes direct. "I said Dad in the warehouse because I didn't... It came out. I don't know if that's... It's fine," Damien said. "Whatever feels right to you is fine." "What feels right might change," Owen said. "That's fine too." Owen looked at him steadily for a long moment, the look of someone running the final check on a calculation before committing to the result. "Okay," he said. He went to the van. Damien stood in the parking lot and watched him go, and then looked at Ivy, who was loading Owen's gear bag into the back and had clearly heard none of the conversation, which was exactly the right amount to have heard. She closed the van door and walked toward him. She stopped at the distance that had been their default. Not far, not close. The uncertain middle distance of two people renegotiating terms. "You stayed for the whole game," she said. "Yes." "You didn't have to." "I know." She looked at him. Something in her face was different from the February face and the warehouse face and the 4 a.m. kitchen table face. All of those had been faces under pressure, faces doing the work that crisis requires. This face was something more ordinary, the face of a person who has come through something and is standing on the other side of it in the afternoon sun in a school parking lot and finding out what remains. "I want to show you something," she said, "if you have time." He did. She drove him to the shop on Harbor Street. It was closed. Thursday afternoon, she closed at 2 on Thursdays. But she unlocked the front door and led him through the familiar space, past the counter where the white tulips had been exchanged 4 years running, through the workroom with Owen's potting stool and the good shears and the smell of soil and sweetgrass, and out the back door into the yard. He stopped. The yard behind Rowan's flower shop was not large, maybe 60 feet deep, running back to a low stone wall that separated it from the alley. But what had been there in April, a practical working space, some raised beds, storage containers for soil, had been transformed. The beds had been expanded. Somebody had pulled the storage containers to one side and cleared the full width of the space. The soil was freshly turned and dark. And in the near beds, just beginning to push through the surface, the unmistakable narrow spears of tulip shoots, dozens of them, organized in a grid that suggested someone had applied the same methodical approach to flower planning that they applied to bookkeeping systems and baseball field geometry. "He planted them in March," Ivy said. "Owen. He asked me if we could expand the back beds, and I said yes without asking what he was planting, because he usually knows what he's doing." She stood beside Damien looking at the yard. "He didn't tell me until they started coming up last week." "White tulips," Damien said. He said... She stopped, cleared her throat. He said he wanted to grow them instead of buy them. He said it made more sense. Damien looked at the shoots coming up through the dark soil, small and patient, doing what they were built to do, indifferent to everything that had happened above ground level over the past several months. The harbor light came over the stone wall and lay across the beds in long gold bars, and the air smelled of the ocean and growing things, and the particular quality of late spring in a harbor town when the season has finally committed. He thought about 9 Aprils, about the drive up the coast with the windows down, about the specific ritual of it, the containment of it, the way he'd convinced himself that the annual 20 minutes constituted a kind of faithfulness, when what it actually constituted was the careful management of an absence he'd chosen and couldn't undo. He thought about the first time he'd bought the tulips, 19 years old, 2 years out of Seabrook Cove, driving up on a Tuesday in April because it was the anniversary of something he'd decided not to name, standing outside the shop for 20 minutes before going inside and asking for white tulips from a girl who wasn't Ivy, wasn't even close to Ivy, but who worked in the shop that Ivy's grandmother had built, and going back to the car with the flowers and sitting there for a long time before driving south. He'd done that for 9 years before Ivy took over the shop. He'd walked in for the first time and found her behind the counter and had almost walked straight back out, and the fact that he hadn't, the fact that he'd stood at that counter and ordered the tulips with his hands completely steady and his voice completely even and driven home afterward and sat in the study with the flowers and the specific cold understanding that every decision he'd ever made had been wrong. That was its own kind of reckoning. "I have something to tell you," Damien said. Ivy looked at him. "I've been coming to the shop since before you took it over," he said. "Since I was 19. The woman who ran it before you, Margaret, your grandmother's girl from Gloucester." "I know Margaret. She was the one selling me tulips for 5 years before you came home." Ivy was very still. "I didn't come back because I found out you were running the shop," he said. "I came back because I always came back. And then you were there." He held her gaze. "I want you to know that it was always this. Not the organization, not any of that. It was always just this." She looked at him for a long moment. The harbor light moved across the yard. "That's possibly the most complicated thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I know. You bought flowers from my grandmother's shop for 5 years before I came home. Yes, for me. For the idea of you, which is not the same thing, and I understand that." She was quiet. Working through it, he could see her doing it, the careful assembly of information into a structure that could hold it. "Why tulips?" she said. "I never asked you that directly. Why specifically white tulips?" "Because when we were Sixton," he said, "you told me that white tulips meant atonement. You'd been reading the language of flowers, that Victorian thing, assigning meanings. You said white tulips were what you sent when you'd done something wrong and wanted to start over." Ivy closed her eyes briefly, opened them. "I forgot I told you that," she said. "I didn't." She turned back to the garden, to the shoots coming up through the dark soil, to the patient architecture of something planted in winter that was only now becoming visible. "You've been apologizing for 9 years," she said, without ever saying a word. "Yes. That's—" She laughed, slightly, the short involuntary sound of someone confronting an absurdity that is also simultaneously the truest thing they've heard. "Damien, that is such a—" She stopped, shook her head. "You could have just talked to me." "I know. That's all it would have taken. You could have walked in that first year and just—" "I know." She looked at him. The laugh was gone, and what was underneath it was not anger. They were past the clean anger, which had its own kind of clarity. What was underneath was something more complex and more permanent. The look of someone who has done the accounting and arrived at a number that is neither loss nor gain, but some third category that doesn't have a simple name. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "In Seabrook Cove?" "Actually stay." "I've been looking at a place," he said. "On the harbor side. It needs work." "What kind of work?" "Structural. The kitchen's a problem. The back porch has rot." She nodded slowly. "Owen's good with tools," she said. "He'll tell you what you're doing wrong." "I expect he will." The afternoon was moving toward evening. The harbor light was changing color, going amber and low, the quality of it that belonged specifically to this place and this season and nowhere else. A fishing boat was coming in, far out on the water, the sound of its engine just reaching them over the stone wall. "There's a Spring Blossom Festival," Ivy said. "Next weekend. The town does it every year. There are booths. Oh, and school has a booth. It's a lot of people and a lot of noise, and it's genuinely chaotic, but he likes it." She paused. "I'm going." "Can I come?" Damien said. She looked at the tulip shoots, at the harbor, at him. "Yeah," she said. "You can come." They stood in the garden until the light failed, not talking much, which was its own kind of language. The language of two people who had said the hard things and survived the saying and were now in the quiet on the other side of it, finding out what grew there. The tulip shoots moved slightly in the evening wind off the water, patient, green, doing the long, slow work of becoming what they were always going to be. Inside the shop, the closed sign hung in the window, and the register was locked, and the good shears were on the second hook, and the workspace was ready for morning. For the ordinary work of a day that would begin before sunrise and require specific knowledge and careful hands and the particular attention of someone who understood that growing things needed consistent presence, not grand gestures, not periodic visits, not 20 minutes once a year, just showing up, just that, every day. Just being there when the light came through the window and the harbor woke up and the work was waiting and the people you'd chosen to build your life around were already moving through the rooms you shared, expecting you to be there because you had said you would be, and you were the kind of person who meant what you said. That was the whole of it. The harbor moved. The boats went out in the morning and came back in the evening, and the tulips grew upward through the dark soil, and the town of Seabrook Cove went on being exactly what it had always been. Small and coastal and indifferent to the complicated histories of the people who chose to stay in it. Spring came the way it always came, without asking permission, without promising anything, just arriving, the way good things do, on an ordinary morning when you were already there waiting.